here, just like anywhere, there's certainly people who are struggling and maybe trying to figure out, how to put food on the table, or maybe how to stay safe, how to keep their family safe, and people who are maybe having some health challenges that they're working through. Well, getting a clear sense of our purpose and worth and value, that can really help us reason through some of these difficult issues and find healing. And by healing, when I talk about healing today, I'm talking about an elimination of whatever the problem is, whatever the inharmony is in our lives. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about what our purpose is. Because as we get a clear sense of our purpose, then that helps us get a better sense of our value and worth. We're going to talk about where that value and worth really come from. And we're going to talk about what it means to view ourselves and others from a more spiritual or godlike point of view. And we're going to do all of this from the perspective of Christian Science. Now, Christian Science is deeply rooted in the Bible. And a lot of times that's the first question I'll get from people. Christian and science, how do those two words even fit together? Well, it's Christian because it's based on the words and works of Christ Jesus. And Christian Science has a deep reverence for Jesus, acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, the promised Messiah, the Comforter. And it's science. Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at science. Some people talk about it as knowledge or something that can be proven in our lives. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is I went to college at San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly. Does everybody know where that is, or most of you? And I majored in agronomy or agriculture. Actually, the actual title of my degree is crop science. So there we go, there's a science. I learned how plants grew, and as I studied and sometimes worked hard at it, I got a better understanding of the way that plants grow and the way that water and nutrients work. And hopefully that helped me. I would keep that in mind as I went about my farming, and that helped me be a better farmer. And that's the way that I see Christian Science. It's taking those words and works of Christ Jesus, keeping it upmost in our thought, and then seeing how that can be used in our lives, looking from that Christian Science perspective. So, is everyone ready to start this topic of why everyone's needed? And all of you there online watching live stream, again, welcome to you as well. So we're going to start. Are you guys feeling like you're in a little imaginative mood? Anyone feeling imaginative a little bit? Okay. Well, imagine that you're a bolt. Can you do that? That's when sometimes I get the little quizzical looks. What? Imagine that you're a bolt. Well, you guys got hardware stores around here, right? Like you're a bolt in one of all those boxes and bins maybe in all those hardware stores, maybe in the whole greater Los Angeles area. All those boxes and bins of bolts, and you're just one of them. I like scales, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how valuable would you feel? Pretty low, yeah. What if you found you were a specially made bolt? Would that help at all? A little bit. What if you found that you were a bolt with a purpose? And that your purpose was to hold these timbers together on a bridge, these metal beams on a bridge. And you hold those together, and without you, those beams would collapse. The whole bridge would collapse. And maybe this is a big bridge. I don't know. You've got bridges around here, I know. Maybe it's a big bridge between two population centers. And there's all this transportation, commerce going back and forth over this bridge. Maybe you got business or church or friends or work on one side or the other of the bridge. Well, without you, that one little bolt, none of that could go on. None of that connection could go on. And then if anyone want to take a closer look at the bridge, let's take a closer look. And you'll see that you're not the only bolt on that bridge. There's hundreds or thousands of other bolts, a lot like you. They might have different color, shape, size, but they're each fitting into that bridge in their own unique way, holding that up as well. And that just kind of gives us a fun little example of how it is that each and every one of us is needed in God's universe. So we're not just some unneeded, unnecessary, worn, rusty, old, used up part. No. Each and every one of us has been created with purpose and on purpose. And I love thinking about that we've each been made on purpose. What does that mean to be made on purpose? So that we can help fulfill that purpose. Well, this isn't what the world says, right? The world has a whole different way of measuring our value and worth. So you're going to help me build a little something up here, and maybe those of you in the back can't quite see it, but we're going to build a little scale here. And we're going to call it the world's worthiness scale. And I'm just going to input into that scale all of the things that the world says gives us our value and our worth. You've probably heard the phrase net worth. Well, what are some of the things that the world says gives us our value or worth?
Status.
Status, yep. What else?
Money.
Money, yeah, that's usually, yep, the money, yeah, the more money we have, the more worthy we are. What else? Pardon? Affluence. Affluence, uh-huh. What about age? Contribution, yes. Age? What else? Employment, yep. Gender, unfortunately still. Ethnicity, family background. We're just going to be plugging all these things into this world's worthiness scale. All the things that the world says. Now, sometimes when we jump on that scale, we might feel pretty high, like we're doing pretty well in all these areas that the world says gives us our value and worth. Then sometimes we might be feeling kind of low. Sometimes we might really feel judged. I don't know if there's anything worse than really feeling judged by someone else's standards and what they think gives you your value and worth. And if we look at ourselves, maybe sometimes we'll see that maybe we're judging others along that world's worthiness scale. But don't you think there's something other than that really gives us our value and our worth? Am I seeing any? Just making sure we're here. Let's do this. Let's everyone take just 10 seconds and think about someone in your life that you feel is worthy, has value to you. Just think of, it doesn't have to be the most valuable, but just think of someone in your life. Does everyone have someone? And now I'm not going to ask you who it is. But I am going to ask if anyone wants to share why. Why is it that that person is valuable?
So I'm thinking in general of Christian Science practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
And they have value because they assist in the healing and rejuvenation of thought.
Someone who assists, a practitioner who helps in the healing. Yes?
Because they are themselves.
Because they are themselves. That's why you found them valuable. Who else has some? Yes?
My sister, because she's so good, and no matter what I do to her, she still loves me.
Unconditional love. I bet it's the other way around as well. Good. Anyone else? Yeah. Integrity. Compassion. Yeah. You guys are talking about what I would call godlike qualities. I haven't heard anyone say it's because of how big their house is or how fast their car goes or maybe how bright and shiny their tennis shoes are. You're talking about these deeper qualities, these godlike qualities that are innate in every one of us. And that's what really gives us our worth and value. That's the entirety of who we all really are. And if we look at this for just a minute, we can see that these qualities don't come from ourselves. You know, it doesn't matter how big our heart or our brain or our foot is to determine how kind we are. There's something else that gives us these qualities. And I would say that something is God. Now, I know there's a lot of people who question whether God really exists. And I think a lot of that is due to the common concept of God is just too small. We know how big the universe is. And we're trying to think of how big this infinite God is. And so it's really important to get this, to try to expand our sense of what God is. And one of the ways that I like to do that is to go to the Bible. Some of you might know that Christ Jesus once said that God is spirit. Well, what's that like? Infinite spirit. That's a big concept. I don't understand it certainly fully, and I keep trying to understand more and more. But what I can see is that if God is infinite spirit, that means God's so much more than just, I don't know, a man with a beard in the sky somewhere, or a person anywhere for that matter. But God as infinite spirit is a presence and a power, a non-physical power that we can really feel in our lives. The Bible says that God is love, and maybe that's the most common way that people think of God. God is love. And the Bible tries to describe this infinite love of God in many different ways. Like an eagle that rouses her chicks and hovers over her young, so he spread his wings to take them up and carried them safely on his pinions. And pinions are flying feathers. What I love so much about this passage is it shows the compassion of God's love, the tenderness, hovering over us, doting over us, knowing every need that we have and supplying it. And yet it also shows the strength of God's love. Maybe we come upon some obstacle in our life. Well, that love of God just puts us on its back and takes us up and over whatever that problem, whatever that challenge is. There's other ways to describe God other than spirit and love. And one of them, from the very beginning of the Bible, talks about God being the only creator. Well, another word for creator is cause. And every cause needs something. What does every cause need? What's that? An effect, that's right. Every cause needs an effect. I mean, if I'm up here blowing on a horn, beating on a drum, if that's the cause, there needs to be an effect, which is what? Did somebody say music? I like that when I hear music. Sound, noise, music, right. And it's the same in this infinite universe of God that's right here. God being the only cause needs an effect. That's where we all come in. We're the effect of God's spirit, infinite spirit of God's love. Whatever it is that God is, we can know that we're all, each of us, the effect of that. That's our purpose. That's who we are, the effect of God. God is also infinite. There's cause and effect. In order for God to be infinite, God has to be infinitely expressed. There couldn't be something infinite that had a finite expression. And so if you think about it, if any one of us here in this room or those of you online, if anyone here didn't exist, there'd be a little less of God expressed, right? There'd be a little less joy, strength, peace, whatever it is that you're expressing. There'd be a little less of that being expressed. And that shows us why we're needed. We're here to complete this infinite universe of God. Actually, that makes us entirely essential. Because again, every cause has to have an effect. Well, these are some pretty big ideas about God. But what's important is that we take these ideas and use them in our lives. How can we make these big ideas practical in our lives? And don't ever let me get too far today in talking with you without bringing us back to how we can use these ideas in our lives. So let me share an example of a woman who did this, who got this bigger sense of God and how it had an impact on her life. So there's a woman that I know who for many years lived in a really abusive family. She was never told that certainly wasn't told that she was needed, valued. She was never even told that she was loved, if you can imagine that. All growing up, never told that she was loved. She had long, dark periods of depression, and she had a lot of suicidal thoughts. She just wondered if she even really belonged here at all. And this all came to a head when she was in her early 20s. At this point in her life, she was nearly flunking out of school. She was broke. She didn't have any friends or family, nobody she could confide in. She didn't have any deep connections with anyone. And she had a drug addiction. Well, one night, she was thinking about all of this, thinking about her prospects in life, and it all seemed really hopeless. So much so that she came to the just heart-wrenching conclusion that ending her life was her only option. Imagine that, ending your life, your only option. And there's people today that are feeling that way. So the next day, she wrote a suicide note. And she actually headed for a bridge. She headed off for a bridge. She was going to jump off and end her life. But as she was actually on her way to that bridge, she bumped into someone who knew her just a little bit. And that woman didn't know her well, but she knew that something was wrong. And so that woman took some time out of her day. She stopped. She chatted with her for a little bit. And then she said, I have a book here, and I think you might find it helpful. And she handed her a copy of this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by the founder and discoverer of the Christian Science movement, Mary Baker Eddy. And this book shows the Christian Science approach to understanding the Bible and shows how we can live those promises that are in the Bible. And that's what I love about the Bible so much. It's just filled with promises. Whatever it is that we're looking for in our lives, there's a promise in this book. Promises of health, promises of safety, promises of redemption. Religion, Christianity, those were the last thing in the world that woman thought she wanted at that point in her life. But because this other woman had been so kind, she took this book, Science and Health, and they parted ways. She ended up not going to the bridge, or probably I wouldn't be telling this story today, and she went home. And in the ensuing weeks, she started to read Science and Health. But her purpose in reading it was to show how ridiculous Christianity and religion were. And so as she read, she fought and she struggled and she argued with all those ideas that it was presenting to her. These were new ideas about the nature of God, that God was an all-loving God, not a wrathful, vindictive, punishing God. And they were new ideas about herself, too, that as God's offspring, her true nature was entirely good and pure and lovable. And the more she read that book, the more it started to make sense to her. And then she took a look at her life and she realized that everything was starting to turn around. School just suddenly seemed easier. Money and finances that had always been such a stress and strain to her she just found that her needs were starting to be met in more natural, easy ways, and she never again had that real strong sense that she didn't know where her next meal was going to come from. She found that she started getting more friends. She started getting deeper connections with others. She later went on and got married and had a long, loving marriage. She ended up passing all her grades that semester, and then she graduated, and then she went on to graduate school. And also gradually, she lost any desire for drugs, or sort of maybe an excuse, or the reasons that she thought she had for taking those drugs. Those all slowly went away until they were completely gone. And also what went away were all those long, dark periods of depression and those suicidal thoughts, completely gone. Her whole life had been transformed. So what happened here? She was just getting a clearer sense of her unbreakable connection to God. Cause and effect. That effect can never be separated from the cause. She said probably the most important thing was just getting a clear sense that she had a purpose, that she had value. She was really saved. She was saved from death, from ending her own life. She was saved from those dark thoughts. And that's something that Christian Science offers. We can be saved from whatever it is in our lives here and now. We don't have to wait for some future time to do that. And if she can do that, any of us can do that. I think it's maybe worthy here to note that it was a lot of work. Some of this was a lot of work. Now, I've had a lot of healings, and remember, that's the elimination of whatever the problem is. I've had a lot of healings in Christian Science. Some of them have come quickly, but a lot of them have taken work. And that's probably in any aspect of our lives, right? Worthwhile things sometimes take a lot of work, and it took a lot of work for her. But she did find that complete elimination of many of those problems, of all those problems that I was talking about. So how can we do this a little bit? How can we get this clearer sense of the allness and goodness of God and of our unbreakable connection to God's goodness? Well, that's where prayer can come in. And prayer can mean something so simple as, God help me, or God help them. Maybe if we see somebody in trouble. At least that's showing that there's that God is present and that God has power. But let's take this bigger sense of God that we're trying to get today. Let's take this bigger sense and see how that can maybe help guide us in our prayers. For example, God is all-knowing. So we can see that our prayers don't have to be some kind of informational to try to inform God, the all-knowing, about what's going on. God already knows all that's real and true and good about every one of us. God's all-loving. So our prayer doesn't have to be trying to plead with God to help us or trying to show God how worthy we are to be healed. No, God's love for us is unconditional. Wrong way. Oh, you're looking at my calendar. Okay.
We can't really read it, though.
Okay, well, you're going to get a... Oh, man. Where are we? All-knowing, all-loving. I'm never going to hit that little TV button again. That's a bad one. I need to put a little... So God's all-loving. We've gone over that an all-loving God is not a wrathful God. God's everywhere. So our prayer doesn't have to be some sort of trying to pull God to get closer to us or somehow try to get closer to God. But prayer helps us see that and feel that wherever God is, if God is everywhere, then there's God's love. Now, prayer isn't really the end means of everything. Prayer just helps us get this clear sense of our unbreakable connection to God. Prayer doesn't make our lives suddenly just a bed of roses. Prayer doesn't ignore some of the bad things that happen in our lives. But prayer is a way of bringing healing or bringing an elimination of these problems. You know, our lives sometimes seems to be a mixture, or our world maybe, a mixture of good and bad, or maybe we feel we're that way, that we're this mix of physical and spiritual elements. Well, that's really just a very small, dim, limited sense of who we really are. And through prayer, we get that clear sense of our true being as being the effect of God. And then that dark, limited sense just falls away. One of the things I've noticed since I've been here is a lot of folks in this area like the outdoors. Most people here like the outdoors, like to hike. Does anyone here like to hike? Like to go camping? Maybe even car camping, RV camping? Hearing some, I don't know. You want to go camping? Let's go camping. Let's say we all go camping together. And there's our tent, and we're all sitting around maybe a fire. It's late afternoon on a warm summer day like today. And we can see everything all around us, right? We can see the trees, the bushes. You can see that. Make sure I push the right button. See that little stump over there? But then it gets later on in the afternoon, and all our friends go away, and maybe we're the last one there. And then what happens as things get darker? It gets harder to see, right? You just can't see as well the things around you. And then maybe you hear a little noise somewhere and your imagination carries you away. Maybe your fears start taking hold of you. And that stump over there, that can turn into like a bear. You might be afraid of it for a long time. So how do you get rid of that? You can yell at it, right? You can throw rocks at it maybe get real big, or maybe run away. Anyone know how to get rid of that bear? Yeah. Yeah, you remember, your big old handy-dandy mag flashlight. You pull that out and you shine it on that stump or that bear, and it turns back into a stump. And that's a little bit of the way that I see that prayer brings about healing. It's not really changing the actual situation so much as changing our perspective. It's showing us what's really there, right where that dark, limited, fearful sense was. Through prayer, we get a clear sense that in this universe of God's goodness right here, all there can be is God's goodness. And I've mentioned before that I've had a lot of healings, and I was trying to think of one that I could share today. I've had relationship issues, I've had financial challenges, and I've had some health issues. And the one I'd like to share with you today is one that happened, I think, about in October. And I was working around a house doing some projects, or mainly a project. And I stuck my hand behind, I was outside, and stuck my hand behind the cedar siding. And all of a sudden, I felt this huge prick or pain on my finger, and I pulled my hand out, and a scorpion fell to the ground. Well, I thought the same thing as you guys did. Ooh. Ow, and that really hurts. And of course, first thought was, that's going to hurt for a long time. I'd known a few other people who'd been stung by a scorpion. But then, right, sort of on the heels of that, came this remembering that, wait a minute, I'm in the God's universe right here in all of God's goodness. That God never sent nor allowed pain, that God was all powerful, and therefore whatever that pain was, it had no place in God's universe and no place in who I really was. But I was kind of concerned. I thought, this is kind of a severe thing. I mean, I knew options. Certainly I could have maybe run to the hospital or something, although I was in a pretty remote area. But I thought instead that I would talk about, or that I would call a Christian Science practitioner. And Jennifer had mentioned that earlier, someone who prays to help you find and realize your connection to God. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I can understand, if you pray and you get your thought better, how you can be healed, but, how does this practitioner thing work? Well, I think it's a little bit like, again, you're maybe at that tent when you're hiking and you see that bear there. Maybe you don't have a flashlight, but maybe your buddy does. And your buddy then shines a flashlight on that for you, and so you can see more clearly what's really there. So that's kind of how I see a practitioner working who might not even be in the same state or country that you're in. So I called a practitioner, and then I thought, I'm not going to let this stop me from what I'm doing. I thought I was doing something useful and productive, and I'd had those good, clearer thoughts, so I went back to work. I put on a pair of gloves. I thought that's probably a smart thing to do. Put on a pair of gloves, went back to work, and it wasn't 10 minutes before I suddenly realized, hey, my finger doesn't hurt at all. I didn't even know what finger it was. There was no swelling, no anything. Well, actually the next day, I'd forgotten all about it by the next morning, but when I woke up, there was a little, have you ever had like a little sliver in your finger and you can't really quite find it or know where it is? I don't know. Anyway, I could just feel a little something in my finger that reminded me that that's what had happened. And later I looked it up online to see if there was, some kind of scorpion whose pain suddenly went away, and I think I identified the scorpion and know that, that it's supposed to take, a long time for that pain to go away. So I could see here that this was a clear evidence of getting this clear understanding of God that brings healing. And you'll see in Christian Science that this kind of healing is common and even expected. There's churches of Christian Science all around the world, societies and churches, a lot like the one sponsoring today's talk. And in every one of them, they have Sunday services, and then they have Wednesday evening meetings. And in every one of those Wednesday meetings, there's a time for people to get up and share how they've been healed. And I've shared my story several times, this one with the scorpion. Just everyday folks, and think about that, all around the world, every Wednesday, there's folks gathering to share how they've been healed through Christian Science. The church headquarters is in Boston. They publish weekly and monthly magazines, and in every one of those, there's accounts of people who've been healed. This book, Science and Health, the last 100 pages, all it is. Accounts of people who've been healed, in this case, just through the ideas that they got by reading this book. So you can see there's really a mountain of evidence, a mountain that shows the reliability, the dependability of this kind of Christian Science prayer, this kind of mental healing. And it shouldn't be any surprise, because this is the same kind of healing that Jesus did. Christian Science is a discovery of the method that Jesus used. And he healed all kinds of people. He didn't care what they were like on that world's worthiness scale. He just healed people. He healed the rich as well as the poor. He healed those who were accepted in society as well as the outcasts. And he healed rather than judged or condemned those who had made all kinds of poor choices and made all kinds of mistakes. And he could do that because he could see their true nature, that unbreakable connection that every cause has with effect. He could see the godlikeness in everyone. And I said this was a discovery. This science is a discovery, and it was discovered by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. And in her discovery, she wasn't like sitting in some high tower somewhere writing down these ideas or coming from some theological really point of view. She studied the Bible. She loved the Bible. But she had a tough life. So she was really looking for healing in her life. And I'll just give you an example. She was born in 1821, but in the 1840s, just in sort of a snapshot of her life, she had married, she'd fallen in love, married, but less than a year after that wedding, her husband caught yellow fever and died. And so she was not only found herself alone, single, but pregnant. Well, her family tried to help out with the raising of her child. But, again, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a influence, how much legal influence did she have on the raising of her child or the custody of her child, a woman back in the 1840s? This is before women could vote. Okay, we see a 0 there. Yep. She had no way of determining who the custodian of her child was. And at that point in her life, her child was really everything to her. As I said, her husband had passed, she'd had other family members pass. But that child was taken from her. You can imagine how difficult that would be. And then a woman in the 1840s trying to find any way of supporting herself, any consistent way. Sometimes she went from house to house, trying to find or staying with whoever would kind of be gracious enough to let her stay with them. I think by today's standards, there was a short period of her life where she would have been considered homeless. And then there was this chronic illness that she's suffered from ever since she was young. And sometimes that would keep her in bed more often than others. You add all these things up, and you can see that if there was ever anyone who might have had reason to feel unneeded, useless, unnecessary in this world, it could have been Mary Baker Eddy at that point in her life before she discovered Christian Science. Well, she struggled through her 20s and 30s, and a lot of her time was spent trying to find a cure for this chronic illness that she'd suffered from. She tried a lot of the different medical systems of the time. And while she was doing that, she was also studying the Bible. And I think that she found that they were converging, that there was this converging in some of her experiments, some of her medical experiments. And she was starting to see that there was a mental nature to healing. She actually healed a couple of people, but it wasn't very consistent. And then she had a huge healing herself of something that many people thought she wasn't going to survive. And she had just basically, it was a passage from the Bible that just resonated with her and made her feel that connection to God's goodness. So she knew there was something there, something in the Bible that would bring about healing. And she spent the next several years just reading and studying the Bible to find out what it was that had healed her. And what she came to see and discover is that whatever exists in God's allness and goodness must be entirely good. So whatever's inharmonious in our lives, whether it's some sort of illness, accident, claims of age, heredity, whatever that has no part in who God is, this infinite God, and therefore no part in who anyone truly is, as God's effect, as God's offspring. And she was eventually cured from all of that chronic illness that she'd been suffering from. And imagine that, to suffer all your life from something and to be searching for a solution and to have finally found it. Well, she just wanted to share it with the world. She had such a deep love for others. She didn't want to see anyone suffer. And she had a deep love for God. And she really felt that God, this bigger sense of God, this infinite love, was really behind her and wanting her to share this with the world. Now, for Mary Baker Eddy, healing wasn't just thinking good thoughts and then good things happen. It wasn't like some sort of imagining good and then having it manifest, some sort of mental manipulation. It was that power of God, that Christ, that understanding of God that brings about healing. And as she better came to understand this, she wrote this passage. It is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony. Now here she's using that phrase, divine principle, just another way to describe the nature of God. I see principle as the foundation, the source of all there is. So we could say it's our ignorance that God is our source, which produces apparent discord. It's our ignorance of the allness and goodness of love, God, which produces apparent discord. And then that right understanding of God restores harmony. Well, we all want this harmony in our lives. And we also have a deep desire to share this with others, to help others. I see it all the time traveling. Maybe people helping others with directions or time schedules or whatever it is. It might be just a smile on the bus. You know, just that joy that's a part of every one of us. It's an innate part of us to want to help others. And I think helping others also gives us a sense of value and purpose. We want to feel like we have an impact, that we're useful, and that we can help and bless others as well. You know, even if we're in the most reclusive situation, if we're just totally separate, not have any contact with anyone, we can still have an impact on others. It's our thought. When we think of others, think of them more clearly just as they really are. Shine that flashlight wherever you might be. And that brings about a healing and progress, not only for yourself, but that person that you're thinking of as well. Has anyone here ever baked any bread? Are there any bread bakers around here? 1, 2, 3, all right. What's needed most to make bread? Water or flour or yeast? Darn! Sometimes I can catch people that way. I do hear yeast a lot. You're right. They're all three needed. Flour can't be made bread can't be made without each and every one of them. And that's the way that it is right here. That just kind of points to in God's universe. Each one of those ingredients is equal in value. And each and every one of us is equal in value. That includes those from different backgrounds, those with different points of view, those who might have conflicting interests, those of different political party. It even includes those who we might think are a threat to ourselves or to others or to things that we hold dear. Now, that doesn't mean we just accept or allow ungodlike thoughts or actions either in ourselves or in others. But it's really a way to start bringing an elimination of these problems, maybe these bigger problems in the world. And I'll give you a quick example of how our thought can affect others, how we can pray and help others. There's a man that I know who for many years felt harassed by law enforcement. He was pulled over, followed, searched, more than anyone else he felt. And the only thing, he didn't have a police record, so the only thing that he could attribute this to was the color of his skin, because this man's black. And it really made him angry. He just thought it was such obvious racism and maybe hatred or misunderstanding. Then one night, it happened again. He was pulling out of a mall and forgot to turn on his headlights, and whoop, he was just pulled right over by a police officer. And as the officer started to approach his car, the officer started yelling at him. saying that he smelled drugs in his car and demanded that he get out so that he could search his car. Well, we've all heard of incidences like this, and so had this man, and he wasn't so sure that getting out was such a good idea. But the officer kept insisting. Finally, the officer said, you know what? If you don't get out on your own, I'm going to call a judge. I'm going to get a search warrant, and then I'll search your car. Either way, your car is going to be searched. Well, in the past, this man would have been boiling over by this point. But this time it was different. He'd started a daily study of the Bible and science and health, so he was getting a clear sense of everyone's true nature and of their value and worth. Matter of fact, this was a Wednesday evening, and he was just coming home from one of those Wednesday evening meetings that I mentioned earlier. And he didn't leave what he heard at the door, but he was taking this clearer view with him. Had it right at the top of his head, you might say. And so he was probably as prepared as anyone could be for a situation like this. Well, when the officer acted this way towards him, the interesting thing is the first thing that he kind of thought of as he was given this moment to pray was, I'm not going to let them do this. I'm not going to let, by now there was more than one officer, I'm not going to let them do something that is wrong or maybe they'll get in trouble with later. I'm not going to let them do this. And he thought about them, and he thought, well, as a police officer, they're involved in a public service, and so was he at that point in his life. And he thought they're here to provide protection, safety, security. Those are all things he could get behind. And so in a way, he might not have used these words, but he was really seeing that godlikeness in these police officers. And then he could see whatever was not godlike, that had no true place in who those officers were. Well, as he just kind of thought and prayed this way, God, I'm not going to let them do this, he said he noticed a change in the disposition of this police officer. He quieted down, stopped yelling. The police officer just calmly walked over to him and said in a very respectful voice, "Sir, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm going to have to give you a ticket for driving without your headlights." No mention of drugs, no mention of a search. I wish he had just been given a warning, but he was given the ticket, but he accepted the ticket and drove off. And he later wrote about this incident. Part of what he wrote was, "My prayers helped not only me, but the officers involved as well." You know, that being his goal, to help those officers. He could see the impact of his prayers on those officers. I learned that I don't ever have to feel helpless about injustice of any kind. Helplessness with injustice. I think that's maybe the biggest thing when we see some of the big injustices in the world. We're just helpless. These are just too big of problems. Now, he didn't solve, as we've been seeing lately, he didn't solve all the problems necessarily between differing people or between law enforcement and the public. But he did help a little bit, right? Each of us has our little part to play. And it's helping to bring progress and healing to these bigger world problems. And he ended with, "And I now see prayer as a proactive way to handle tense situations." I think we could all agree that that was a pretty tense situation that we continue to see ending in violent ways. But we also see here the solution. And since we're talking a little bit about sort of these larger issues, just take something in your community. Some way in which maybe you see some injustice bubbling up. It might be the Monterey Park situation, or it might be homelessness, whatever that is, some kind of inequity or injustice. Just take one of those that you'd like to see bettered. You might belong to some organization, and that's fine. But the only way that we're going to come to permanent solution in any of these intractable problems is by starting from this basis, the flour, the water, and the yeast, that everyone is equal. And the wonderful thing is, we don't have to wait for anyone else to get it. This man just knew it for himself about these police officers and helped bring about a resolution in that case. Well, today we've seen how this world's worthiness scale, certainly not the scale on which we can judge anyone's value or worth. The problem with the world's worthiness scale is that it's limited, and our lives are always changing. And at some point, we'll find that needle pointing low. Maybe you're a parent, and you think that your value and worth is mostly driven by how you are as a parent. Well, there's the spoiler alert, right? Kids are always going to grow up, and you'll still be their parent, but you won't have that parenting authority sort of over them. Or if you're a student and you think that your value and worth is dependent on how you do as a student, well, what happens if you start doing poorly, whether it's in academics or socially or some extracurricular activity? Or if you think your value and worth is all wrapped up in your job and then you get fired, or maybe you retire. Now, these are all really important aspects of our lives, but it's not so much what we do as how we do it. It's all that godlikeness, that love and joy, that compassion, strength, honesty, integrity that we're bringing to our lives, bringing to our communities, our friends, our families. That's what gives us our value and purpose. It's pretty well known that when people retire, they can sometimes wonder, what's my purpose now? In the heart of the pandemic, there were a lot of mental health officials who were so deeply concerned because there were so many people just sitting at home wondering, does anything I do really matter anymore? But if we can base our value or worth on something that never changes, this need that every cause has for an effect, God's need to be expressed, we'll see that the need for us never grows old, never retires. We're always needed just as much as we've ever been. Has anyone here ever heard of Simone Biles?
Of course.
Who is she?
Gymnast.
Gymnast, right. Probably considered to be the most dominant female gymnast ever. And you remember what happened in the last Olympics? She started to feel out of sorts. I think they called it the twisties. The most dominant female gymnast, she had to withdraw from the Olympics. And she was judged some for that. There were people looking at her and saying she shouldn't be doing that. But she also received a lot of support. 4 or 5 days after she withdrew from the Olympics, she tweeted this: "The outpouring of love and support I've received has made me realize I'm more than my accomplishments and gymnastics, which I never truly believed before." I just love hearing that when people recognize they're more than their accomplishments. If you think about it, an athlete, what is it that what's their value and worth? It's in the qualities that they're expressing, right? That's what we love to see, the energy, the joy, the strength, whatever that is. And I would argue that an athlete can express that as much or more kind of in their day-to-day life than they do out there on the field. Well, today I hope that we've got maybe just a little better sense of, well, first off, that this world's worthiness scale is not where we should place our value or worth. But it's in those qualities of God. That's the entirety of who we are. And that's the entirety of what makes us all so needed. It actually makes us each essential in God's universe. And I hope this is more than just, a 1-hour talk and we all go home and go our own way, but that you can start taking these ideas and keeping them in the top of your thought. And maybe start studying and looking more deeply into some of these, whether you're a first-timer or whether you're a long-time student of Christian Science, making this larger commitment to just seeing things more clearly for what they really are. That's what I love about Christian Science. It just helps me see things more clearly. And I hope that you are just feeling that love that God has for you. Feeling loved and cherished and needed right here and right now. You've been so great. I've just enjoyed this time with you. I'll be in the back and free to chat with any of you, especially if this is your first time. And now Jennifer's going to come up and share just a little bit about how you can learn more about this through the church that sponsored today's talk. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Thank you those online.